What is choreography for you?
At the moment, I've come down to a very simple image of what choreography is, and that it's to do with things, the way that things change and how that change produces an information which accumulates, if you're lucky, into something that matters or has meaning. So I make this very broad definition to try and include the many people who are interested in choreographic practice also from a non-physical perspective, so what gets called the expanded choreographic field. And I think this is not a complete answer, but I find it a useful way to introduce the idea of choreography to students, because they tend to think of choreography as a way of structuring or ordering experience. So I prefer the idea that when you work choreographically, you find somewhere to begin. And the only important thing is, what do you do next? Everything that matters is in the transition from one thing to the next thing. It's not in the material itself.
How did you start to don't focus on the objects and tools and expanded field of choreography?
Well, I should explain that I invite the students to work with objects, not because I think it's particularly relevant or useful to work with objects. It's just one possible way to work. But I find that it has two advantages. The first thing is that it sidesteps the question, is this work subjective or objective? Because there's always something within the objects that the person chooses which has a sense of their own experience and their own narrative. And then you can invite them to work in more abstract ways, and they don't feel conflicted by the or they don't feel erased by the abstraction. They understand quickly that the two things work together towards feeling and atmosphere and tone. I don't always work with objects. I sometimes ask the students really to only work physically. But I don't know, I just had an instinct it might be a good way to enter the idea of choreographic practice with this group of students in this context, partly because they were coming from different disciplines themselves.
Principles and structures for the workshop.
I think it would be interesting for me to mention that I notice that people from different disciplines are at the moment interested in choreographic practice. I suspect sometimes what they think that choreographic practice can do, it can't actually do. It's very validating as somebody that works with choreographic practice that other people are interested. At the same time, there are many reasons to critique choreographic practice. For instance, you might critique choreographic practice for being a kind of something which comes from the outside and colonizes somebody's body, something which is imposed by a choreographer onto a performer or a dancer. Or you might notice, for instance, that the sense of the choreographic within hip-hop dance practice is very different, and in many other dance forms. So I think it's important that if you approach and work with choreographic practice, you be aware of these critiques. In some ways, I don't believe in choreography. The first question you have to ask is, when is this useful and when is it not useful? Because so many people are interested in it, it's clear to me it's not going to go away. So I go on enjoying being in workshops with young people just to go on trying to figure out why it seems interesting. But in terms of the things that I was looking at, there were three main ideas. The first that I already mentioned is that choreography is about change. I do this, and what matters is the transition between this and what I do next. That's the first thing. The second thing, I work with what is in some ways so familiar that I don't notice it. And that the process is to move this stuff around. So I was trying to introduce the students to the idea of working with the dust that accumulates. Rather than proposing a big idea, or something new, because that's not very ecological. I think the choreographic and dance practice can begin to be a little bit more ecological. That means honor what's in our bodies already. And then the final thing I was working with was the idea of working towards a subject. What happens is that you begin to work, and for most of the time you don't know what you're doing. If you keep applying yourself to it, and if you're lucky, you begin to find something that makes sense, has feeling, has meaning. So the arrival at something that matters in a performance is an act of recognition rather than an act of conscious decision making.
Yesterday you also spoke about the speed. I think a quality for disanchoring the body, putting the body in a territory of the unknown, and what is the privilege of not knowing for the body, and what is its risk?
Well, I think the not knowing is not only about the body. In many ways, the body does know. It's your conscious artistic mind that doesn't know. Accepting that you don't know is in part about trusting what your body already knows.
How can emotional sensuality emerge from this analytic experience and structures?
Well, it's interesting because when you and I were talking yesterday, you commented that the way that I was working with the students was quite analytical, but I was surprised because I didn't think it was. Nor did I think it was structural, and nor did I think it excluded emotion. It's all of those things. But if I ask the question, when is choreography useful and when is it not, then it opens up all sorts of discussions, which are sometimes more philosophical and sometimes more emotional or narrative, or to do with feeling or sensation. All of these things coexist. There often comes this binary between this is analytical and this is about emotion. And it's a completely false binary. Both of these things coexist and overlap all the time. If you make an artwork, and they particularly overlap if you make a durational artwork. Because if you make a durational artwork, the first and foremost thing is that you are responsible for the time of the people who have come to be in the audience, to be a spectator. And therefore you're paying attention to the time as well as everything that is happening through and with the time. They made a movement sequence, and then they added text to the movement sequence, and the movement sequence seemed shorter to me when they added the text, but it was actually exactly the same length. That's very interesting. There was something about attention and the attention of the language which altered the perception of the time. Yeah, I mean, for me, the only thing that structure does is it brings two things together that would not otherwise come together. And when they come together, that makes a third thing which is more powerful. That's the only function of structure or rhythm. I found everybody very open and generous with each other and with me. I could be wrong and I could be being idealistic. This is always a possibility. This kind of study through the body and through movement and through performance, I think can be very useful in many aspects of life, whether or not you end up being a performer or a choreographer. I think there are qualities within this art form that I really appreciate. The ability to collaborate, the ability to listen, the ability to be in service to somebody else while making or while performing, the ability to give people the confidence to move, to be in touch with their bodies. I think it's probably time that the dance institutions understood that they're not necessarily training dancers anymore.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.